Good afternoon and welcome to today's Spaces webinar. We've had over 250 people register, so this is our biggest webinar attendance of all. For those who don't know me, my name is Greg Keeling. I'm the Technical Manager at Essex County Council, a Spaces member, and will be chairing this afternoon's session. We're delighted that Gemma Taylor will be taking us through the latest iteration of the Output Specification, which embeds net zero carbon in operation and climate resilience across the full suite of documents, as well as through the introduction of the Technical Annex 2J. Gemma will be explaining the key changes, referencing the journey which the DfE have taken to arrive at these standards, as well as providing brief updates on ongoing projects and initiatives as the team work towards the next spending review. But before we commence, I will just say a few words about Spaces. We are a unique society that focuses not on our professions, but on delivering and maintaining better public sector buildings. Our membership includes clients, engineers, architects, surveyors, contractors, consultants, academia, civil servants, etc., across the UK from both the public and private sector. Collaboration is at the heart of the society, and our aim is to share knowledge and create networks so our members are aware of the very best practice. Working together is the only way in which we will successfully deliver net zero carbon targets. We have been running a series of net zero carbon events over the last year with many amazing speakers, and we are planning more events too, including on Thursday the 23rd of June at the Montfort University in Leicester, where our study day on net zero carbon and sustainability will take place. This will be a day packed with high quality speakers with both main stage and breakout sessions, and is a great chance to network with colleagues from around the UK. If you're not aware, we also have our own YouTube channel where many of our past presentations can be viewed, and if you're a member, you have access to all areas. Apart from our manager, Fiona Fanning, we are volunteers in Spaces. We don't receive any grants or public funding, and we rely solely on paid membership and sponsorship for those organisations who understand the benefits of collaboration. So if you work in the public sector and you have a .gov UK address, Spaces membership is free, so you have no excuse not to join and be part of a very large network. If you work in the private sector, membership starts from as little as £100 per annum. And just to reassure everyone, anyone thinking of joining, we don't share your details with third parties. Okay, so that's the advert over. Now with regards to today's event. Slides will be made available on the Spaces website to all delegates, and a link will be emailed next week to you. If you're a member, you'll also get a link to this recording. That's for members only. Any questions you need, just type them into the chat as we go along. Please keep them concise. We will ask as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. In the event that you experience any technical issues, the best advice is to log out and log back in. That generally resolves the majority of issues. Webinar Jam also recommends switching off any unnecessary programs that may be running in the background. And sorry, but we can't deal with any technical individual IT questions during the presentation. So over to Gemma Taylor. Who is Gemma? Gemma is an energy, engineering, carbon and performance lead within the DfE design team. Having joined the Department for Education from private practice in 2020, she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in both the architectural and engineering design field. Gemma currently leads on the development of climate resilience policy, technical standards development, pilots, research projects and spending review bids. Outside of working hours, Gemma also volunteers her time to contribute to the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers and the Spaces community. She won the Spaces Young Visionary Award in 2018 and is the current Vice Chair of the Sibsey Schools Design Group and holds the Sibsey Young Engineers Network Global Vice Chair position. So Gemma, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that, Greg, and good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm still okay to say Happy New Year, even though we're almost in February, which is really scary, isn't it? So anyway, it's lovely to see so many of you on the call this afternoon, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Greg. I can see a few familiar names and faces, but for those of you that I've never engaged with before, this is me. I'm Gemma Taylor, Energy, Carbon and Performance Lead in the DfE Capital Design Team. It's really, really lovely to have the opportunity to speak to you all today about the exciting work that we have coming up and that we've been doing in the design team in the lead up to the launch of the new Output Specification, which I will refer to as S21, but also some projects and priorities for this year and years to come. So before I start, as Greg mentioned, I will say that I have saved a good chunk of time at the end for questions. So please do put your questions in the chat bar throughout the presentation. So, as I mentioned, I work within the DfE Capital Design team. For those not familiar, we are the team responsible for setting technical standards across school settings. We own, write, and update Output Specification and the accompanying Technical Annex technical guidances, such as building bulletins. Now, throughout this presentation, you'll hear me refer to schools a lot. Of course, a lot of you will be aware the principles apply across all education settings, and we have recently launched an FE output specification, which aligns with what I'm going to present today as well. So today I'm going to speak to you about our sustainability and climate change journey over the past 2 years and bring you up to speed with our latest technical standard developments for new build settings, which launched in November 2021. We refer to this iteration as S21. I will also speak to you about some of our projects and priorities for this year and beyond, and as we start our journey and work towards the spending review in 2025. Now, before I dive in, I just want to say that whilst I am the spokesperson for today's session, it really has been a colossal team effort to bring all of this evidence and intel together in order to develop the position that I'm able to have the pleasure of presenting to you today. This effort is not only within our team, but also with our supply chain partners and wider colleagues across the department, which many of whom are on the call in the audience today. I think one of the most wonderful things about education is that it brings together a lot of different people with many skills in diverse areas and backgrounds. And Greg mentioned a few at the start. So to ensure we're all on the same page, I will very quickly set the scene and give the basic context to the topic of climate change itself. I think most of today's audience is more than familiar with climate change as a whole and understand the concept of greenhouse gases. So all I will say is that without any greenhouse gases, life as we know it would not even exist. However, scientists do attribute the global warming effect to the global warming trend to the human expansion of the greenhouse gas effect. Effectively, our human activity is adding too many of these gases into the atmosphere, which is making a once balanced system act out of kilter and is having adverse impacts on the ecosystem and our planet. This is what we call climate change. Water vapour, nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide are the 4 major greenhouse gas contributors. Each of these gases interrelate and have an impact on the ecosystem, but the prominent greenhouse gas, which we as a technical standards and design team have direct control over through our standards, and we will focus on today, is our use of carbon dioxide, which is predominantly caused through the burning of fossil fuels to deliver heating and hot water, and electricity to some extent to our buildings. So we know climate change is accelerated by human activity, but what human activity is causing climate change? Where do we use the greenhouse gases? And where can we make positive contributions? This chart shows the world's worst 5 polluters. And where do school buildings come into this? The short answer is 65%. We can directly control 65% of our contributions. Now, of course, education also impacts those not highlighted, such as agriculture and transport. And the recent DfE Sustainability and Climate Change Draft Strategy looks across the whole piece for the education sector and picks up this more holistic outlook. However, today, as I've said, we're focusing on output specification, and these on the screen is where we can make a real difference in delivering healthy and resilient school buildings. So how do we go about changing this? The impact of climate change and the response can be split into 2 camps, mitigation and adaptation. These camps are interrelating, but for ease, it's best for me to speak about them separately before bringing them back together. The important point is you cannot do one without the other. Mitigation is effectively net zero, getting your greenhouse gases to equal 0, limiting the greenhouse gas effect that causes climate change. Adaptation is the younger brother or sister of mitigation. This is about responding to the negative impacts and challenges we are already facing. As I've said before, net zero is the flavour of the headlines, but climate change is already here. Its risks for now and for the future already exist, and their future impacts are well evidenced. So we cannot ignore its wider context within our response. Looking at the school estate as one, we know that schools contribute to 2% of the total UK carbon emissions. This is equal to around 25% of the total public sector emissions, and this is where we can make a difference for mitigation. When we look at adaptation, we know that the land cover of the school estate is twice the size of the Isle of Wight. All of these facts demonstrate that we have lots of potential to make a positive difference when we recognise the estate as one whole entity. So first, if we take a look at where we can influence mitigation. This is effectively the presence of carbon within buildings. Where does carbon exist? Let's break down some jargon. So operational carbon is the load created using energy to heat and power a building. Embodied carbon is the carbon release in the production, manufacturing, transportation of building materials. And whole life carbon is the carbon emissions resulting from the construction and the use of the building over its life, including demolition and disposal. The standard adopted across industry and how this is broken down is visually represented and shown in the diagram on the left-hand side. The orange represents operational carbon and the pink represents embodied carbon, and the combined total of these represent the whole life carbon. Now, I think we're all quite good at understanding mitigation. It involves numbers and we have specific feedback and targets. As engineers and built environment professionals or end users, we love stats and numbers. We can track and quantify our energy and carbon. We can still do this better, and we've been chasing the performance gap for a long time, but at least there's some figures and stats behind it and we know how to. So that's mitigation. However, the more tangible elements can be quite tricky. So let's have a look at climate adaptation. In 2017, the Committee on Climate Change released a report which presented risks and opportunities associated with our changing climate. There were over 50 risks in total attributed to the built environment. And this included items such as public transport. However, the ones that I've highlighted on the screen obviously are not all 56, but they are the ones which we're able to have a direct influence on, and the more poignant ones that we can influence our technical standards for school buildings and grounds. For those on the call more familiar with the work carried out by the Committee on Climate Change, you will be aware that they issued a subsequent report in 2021. However, the reason I share this one with you today is because this is the knowledge base which ultimately led to the development of our new standards that I present today. It's important to note here that what also falls into the adaptation piece is the social activity and human behaviour. We believe that education plays a vital role in the response to climate change, not only through our buildings, but also the societal benefits through the pester power and the ripple effect that schools and pupils can have on the wider community. We are in a really unique position. Therefore, we felt it was important that we led the way and strove for standards above and beyond minimum building regulations, acting as a catalyst for change and supporting cross-government development and policy. Just to put the adaptation challenge into a bit more of a context, without biodiversity, this would be the reality of our supermarket shelves. We rely on biodiversity to fill our shelves. Some of you may have seen as well, in support of climate adaptation, the Environment Act, a legislation that will protect and enhance our environment for future generations, passed in UK law in November. Right, so that's the context, and what did we do with this information? As a team, we looked at and digested all of this data and embarked on a multitude of research and pilot projects to gather evidence in support of the new standards, which I will now take you through. Some of you may very well have been and may still be involved in some of these pilot projects. Across all of our central programmes, we have a varied type of pilots ongoing. So moving from left to right, we have passive house pilots which are testing a defined energy outcome to a fixed standard. These are testing extremely onerous fabric and performance standards, supply chain capability, as well as testing the rigor of our own internal processes. Then we have our net zero pathfinders. These are testing a single defined output, zero carbon, through our MMC framework, defining an output and asking the market to provide the solution. We have sustainability pilots running across both free school and PSPP programs. These pilots provide some fixed options for output, and we ask the market to select and define the output they wish to go for. These test the market capability and appetite in delivering to a range of fixed standards from existing delivery all the way to exemplar standards. And last but by no means least, we have a biophilic primary pilot running in Derby, which I will talk a little bit more about later on. But this is testing how we provide greater access to nature and is the catalyst of the development of a biophilic brief for education settings. So what is the DfE strategy for new build projects? What are the changes in the S21 launch that went live in November? So our output specification, which outlines school standards, has undergone a wholesale restructure to incorporate these standards. If we look first at this slide at the strategic level and aims. So to support climate mitigation, we are asking for all buildings to be low energy, fossil fuel free and net zero carbon in operation at handover, without the use of off-site offsets. This means that all emissions are to be offset on site using technologies such as photovoltaics or solar panels. In addition to this, we then require all projects to quantify the embodied carbon content at key project milestones. This remains as a quantification for now and is purposely built in this way to upskill the industry and build a set of reliable data which can be used as evidence moving into future policy, as I will come on to later. As you can see on the left, and as depicted by the previous slides, the adaptation challenge for biodiversity collapse is equally, if not more important for us to respond to, and should not be forgotten in the midst of all of the net zero headlines. We recognise this, and that's why our standards take the holistic view, and we support climate adaptation. So we're asking for you to deliver healthy and productive sites which respond to user needs, not only for now, but also for the future in terms of overheating and flooding. We are also responding to the DEFRA 25-year Environment Plan and the Environment Act to ensure a biodiversity net gain is achieved across all sites. So what does this step change look like for a new build in slightly more detail? So the top row shows our previous OS 17 standard, and the row in bold shows a typical new build scheme under the new standards. Moving from left to right, the predominant changes can be seen across both mitigation and adaptation. Step 1, mitigation is first and foremost about delivering a low energy building. To support this, we have chosen to set minimum DfE fabric efficiency standards and thermal performances that exceed building regulations. The reason for this is because we understand and recognise the school estate and our user group. Currently, gas is around 4 times cheaper than electricity, so this is an essential step to ensure that the operational bills are not negatively impacted by this change. On switching our heat source from gas to electricity, it's vital that we reduce the energy demand in the first place. The best sustainable building designs energy out in the first place. It will therefore not be a surprise when I say that we're moving away from gas boilers as a preferred heating solution, and our preference will change to heat pump delivery, and a hierarchy of this has been introduced into Technical Annex 2F. First and foremost, district heating, then ground source heat pumps, then air source heat pumps, and only where it can be technically justified, not possible to do any of the aforementioned, we will accept gas boilers. Once energy is reduced and the heat is electric, we must then ensure that all of this energy is offset using on-site technologies to achieve that net zero balance and support grid decarbonisation amongst local communities. You'll also see there that the energy use intensity targets have reduced considerably to support all of this. So I mentioned no offsite offsets, and we are often asked and challenged, why don't you accept offsets? We feel it's extremely important to achieve this through on-site provision to ensure that our end users directly benefit from the energy generated, and also to support that wider grid decarbonisation. Otherwise, we may be asking our end users to pay annual offsetting taxes alongside their bills. To respond to the effects we already face through climate change, we have increased our overheating standards now to comply with a +2 degree climate projection. And we're also asking for projects to prove that they can future-proof to a +4 degree climate projection without any structural intervention or cooling. And cross-ventilation has now become a mandatory requirement to support this. By adopting this policy, we will save on major retrofits in the future and mitigate future overheating should the climate warm to these levels. So for context, the Committee on Climate Change are already projecting these levels of temperature rises by the end of the century. Then the final two columns on this table pick up on the wider adaptation pieces and the recommendations from the Committee on Climate Change that I spoke about earlier. And what I will say on that is that integrating buildings and grounds can yield maximum benefits. Site-wide green infrastructure not only supports flood reduction and biodiversity, but can also act as free local shading, and outdoor canopies, which house photovoltaics, can also act as covered outdoor learning or dining areas to provide the spaces to feed into that opportunity that was presented earlier. As temperatures get hotter, we will want to spend more time outdoors, and we will want to experience increased outdoor activity, and these all support that. So I am going to talk about the longer term vision and plan across our team, but before I do, I just want to touch on the elephant in the room, the retrofit of our existing estate. What about the schools which won't be rebuilt between now and 2050? Despite popular opinion, we are really not naive to this matter. We estimate that at least 80% of the existing stock will still exist in 2050. The scale of the challenge that we face is huge. It's not all doom and gloom. Despite an unsuccessful settlement in this SR for retrofit, we did manage to secure the funding as part of S21 to be able to be in a position to be able to launch the new build standards that I've just run through, which, as you can see from the graphs, do go a long way in supporting meeting the legislative targets. But as you can also see, it's not enough, and we do need to do more in the retrofit space. The scale and immediacy of this challenge that we face is enormous, and I just wanted to use this opportunity to say that we are aware of this, and we have been, and we will continue to knock at the Treasury door for more money to invest in this area. Lots of you will already be aware and familiar with the BEIS-led public sector decarbonisation scheme, which has now had 3 phases of delivery, which provides grant funding to successful bidders to undertake retrofit decarbonisation works across public sector buildings. This grant funding scheme has replaced the Salix Energy Efficiency Loan Scheme, which recognises that the low-hanging fruits could and should be delivered by end users and responsible bodies, where they can see and recognise the payback through savings, and actually instead allocate grant funding to support decarbonisation projects in its place, where the funding or payback argument doesn't stack up in today's money. We at the DfE, of course, fully support this scheme and encourage, if you have not done so already, for you to engage with local schools and responsible bodies to look into how you can access this funding to support the decarbonisation of existing assets. We equally recognise, however, that it doesn't come without its challenges of implementation. And like anything else, there will always be pros and cons. But if you have any experience with the PSDS, good and bad, we would really like to hear from you. We want to learn lessons from this process and understand how we can best support the application of PSDS to ensure education has the best possible chance at securing funding under this scheme. It will also help us to build that evidence base for SR25 when we start thinking about retrofit. So I've given an overview of the step change in the new build standards, and I've just touched on the challenge across the existing estate. So before I close, I wanted to touch briefly on the longer term vision. what's happening between now and 2025 with new build standards, and what may our OS look like in S25. Firstly, looking specifically at the carbon in buildings, mitigation. Quite rightly, we are constantly challenged at the moment from our stakeholders and supply chain who ask, why aren't you looking at embodied carbon now? Our pilots and evidence to date have shown us that the immediate focus should address operational energy for school buildings, which currently accounts for 67% of total emissions. As that operational energy decreases, and we're bringing those energy use intensity targets down, the impact and scale that embodied carbon has will shift and increase, which is where we intend to focus the efforts leading into 2025. We also really believe that the industry is not quite ready yet. The data is coming along, but it's shaky in areas, and we don't want to set targets and drive unintended consequences without thorough consideration and evidence. So asking for that quantification at key project milestones assists us in upskilling certain areas of the industry which are lagging behind on the embodied carbon data. It also supports the gathering of robust evidence to inform future realistic targets. And it sets standards which are achievable and those that deliver the best outcomes for our end users in the long term. Now looking at the longer term on adaptation, and this applies equally to new and existing settings. We want to enhance our knowledge and standards and approach to green infrastructure. The St Mary's Biophilic Primary Pilot in Derby is supporting the development of the evidence and subsequent guidance which will see this area mature in years to come to build on the adaptation proposals which I've just run through for the specification launched in November. These are the 7 core principles which we will look to provide detail through the evolution of a biophilic brief. We believe that a small amount of money, relatively, to improve the access to nature and implement green infrastructure proposals provides a multitude of benefits across sites, and we will be working on gathering evidence to show and implement this. External grounds need to become part of the core brief and question, and we need to think of the site as one, its building and its grounds. We currently have so much focus on the red line of the building, and we really need to change this. To aid these longer-term objectives, alongside our existing pilots and Pathfinder projects, we will be seeking funding and creating opportunities to deliver more pilots and Pathfinders, which look across these very core areas: embodied carbon, green infrastructure, and retrofit. These will support the evidence to underpin these longer-term ambitions on our journey to SR25. Thank you for your time, and my email address is available on the screen there, but I will pause there. And I see there's some questions that have come through on the chat bar. So over to you, Greg and Helen.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma, for taking us through that. There's a few questions that have come in, which we can run through. Start on the first one, which I wanted to raise with you is, do we know what the capital cost uplift percentages are in achieving the latest output spec, S21, compared to the previous output specifications?
I knew there would be a cost question. What I would say is, yes, we do know the difference in cost. I am not in a position to say that today. I'm part of the technical team, the design team, and not the cost team. But we have had that costed. It has gone through our CF21 framework. So yes.
Okay, question here from Stephen is, why is cross ventilation selected rather than MVHR or mixed mode?
That's a good question. So what we found is actually sometimes in terms of if we look at energy and in one lens, and then we start, having single-sided ventilation with heat recovery, etc., that helps with energy. But actually, when we're thinking about the wider benefits of creating healthy and resilient spaces, cross ventilation can provide that better air quality, you get a better feeling as an occupant in a space that has cross ventilation, and it's more about that passive building that can be adaptable in the future. So if we're looking at one lens of energy, then I can see why you might want to go down that road of a sealed box with heat recovery, etc. But as I've mentioned all the way throughout, we're looking at that holistic context of what's a healthy and resilient school building.
Okay, thank you, Gemma, for that. Paul's asked, how are we quantifying carbon? i.e. the new Part L carbon factors or something else?
Can you clarify, Paul, on that question? In what context do you mean? Because we have the grid decarbonisation factors that come through BAYS, and then we also have the default Part L ones. And I think there's a couple of different calculations that you're doing. So obviously we will still need to meet building regulations and do Part L calcs, but there's also sort of operational carbon and whole life carbon calculations that form part of that methodology to prove compliance. So there's a couple of different things going on there.
Okay, Paul, if you want to put some more detail in the chat, then we can come back to your question. Just to explain to people the reason we can't actually do live is there's a slight lag between when we talk and when you talk, and we've tried it once as a test and it doesn't work. So that's why we can't actually take live questions. Christopher Rogers asks, if we can't do heat pumps and so accept gas, will this be a short-term solution? So I guess this is referring to maybe if you haven't got available electricity.
So the standards that I presented today about new builds, I think there would be very, very few settings where you couldn't do a heat pump. If you're referring to refurbishment, again, there will be few scenarios where you can't, but where you can't, yes, it would be a shorter term solution. So what we do ask for our projects that run through the school rebuilding programme, for example, we do ask, we've got the project brief, the funded project, and then we've got the strategic brief, which is that longer term vision to 2050. So we're asking for the funded projects to meet net zero, and then anything that falls outside of that condition need has a projected strategic brief, which shows the school and end users how to get there by 2050. So anything that we're doing today is supported by a strategic vision and a strategic brief for the future, which is helping to inform the projects that we're delivering today.
Okay, thank you, Gemma, on that. Michael's asked a question on overheating. Does the S21 require compliance with only criterion 1 of TM52 or 2 out of 3?
Michael, the overheating risk assessment, BB 101, has not changed in terms of the methodology, so it's the criterion 1. However, what has changed is the weather files that we're asking you to apply. So at the moment, it's still BB 101 is criterion 1 only. However, we do often have consultants also do the criterion 2 and 3 as per TM52 alongside that, just as evidence and advice, really. Okay,
thank you for that one. Andrew Saville has just put, it's brilliant, Gemma, excellent progress through slides. Excellent Department of Environment spokesperson. So I think many of us will know
Thanks, Andrew.
So that's really nice that Andrew's made time to put a compliment in. And Caroline Osborne has also noted, great to see much more emphasis on an investment in school grounds. If you want to, any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said it in the slides anyway, but yeah, we just need to recognise the site as one whole entity, and actually the benefits that you can get from integrating buildings and grounds is amazing. And actually there's some really good tools coming through DEFRA and other departments, which is actually starting to put some quantification and cost benefit analysis to implementing more green infrastructure, etc. So that's helping us bolster our business cases. So yes, we are too equally as delighted, Caroline.
Okay, Andrew's asked a question, is it worth just clarifying the energy intensity targets, which is based around the NCM school year, not the whole year?
Yes, so energy use intensity targets are now set into Annex 2H, and they have been greatly reduced. As you've quite rightly said, they are aligned with the use patterns for educational hours and the annexes of 2H and not the whole year.
Okay, Stefano's asked a question, is the fabric first approach prioritised in comparison to renewable systems?
Yes, absolutely.
That was very well answered. And next one from Claire, has the method of quantifying embodied carbon been set out yet?
Yeah, that's a good question, Claire. There's a lot of different methodologies happening at the minute, a lot of different softwares, etc. But what we're asking for in the spec is, I'm not going to remember the whole number off the top of my head, but there's a British standard that we've asked the embodied carbon calculations to meet, and we've aligned our modules with the UK GBC guidance. So I know that there is some work going in to try and standardise this a little bit more, but at least we will all be meeting that British standard and hopefully singing off the same hymn sheet.
Okay, we've got another question here. Operational from Stephen, operational net zero implies that we need to consider both regulated and unregulated energy use for IT and catering, etc.
Yes, so operational energy and net zero includes all of that. So your small power loads, how the occupants run the building. So what we're seeing more and more is that in CEN meetings, etc., so client engagement meetings, where the school's accessible, those workshops, those trainings, TM54 modelling to bring the users into the fold and really lay out to them that they have a responsibility in making this happen as well, is really starting to happen. So that's exactly correct. It includes everything.
Okay, Peter has asked an interesting question around whilst BB93 and acoustics are very important, it often conflicts on urban sites with the drive to use natural cross ventilation. Given electric vehicles are quieter than petrol ones, should there be a leeway given to new build schools now to future-proof them for quieter streets?
I work with Peter on a number of different projects, and I'll kick him later for asking me such a difficult question. But no, absolutely. So there is BB93 is actually undergoing review at the moment, and we will be considering things like that. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay, Nigel's asking a question around net zero estate playbook is similarly encouraging public sector plan to deliver carbon reducing solutions. What, if any, particular aspect of this is seen as a major contributor to the delivery of success? That's from Nigel. What, if any, particular aspect of this is seen as a major contributor to the delivery of success?
So I think, I mean, I've read it and I've digested it, but verbatim, I wouldn't be able to say right now. I think that the major focus is the decarbonisation of heat. That's the biggest challenge that we've got ahead of us, and actually the energy efficiency that supports that, because the grid, to upgrade the grid infrastructure to take all of the heat that we expect it to take now is a colossal effort and would cost trillions in upgrading. So we need to do our bit in reducing energy efficiency, reducing that performance gap, and also decarbonising heat. I think they're the major contributors, and I sort of go back to those 5 contributions on the chart that I showed earlier. Looking in those areas, I think heat is a big one of those.
Okay, Karen has said, awesome presentation. Thank you. Great to see links and encouragement to PSDS. After doing a lot of decarb work, existing schools, the main question we get from end users is how can we reassure them that the bills and impact of moving from gas or oil to electricity is being thought of as part of overall benefits of decarbonisation? How are the DfE dealing with these in these difficult times?
Where's that question,
That's
Greg?
Karen. It's second from the top.
Okay, I'm just going to reread it. Apologies.
That's okay. I think it's basically around reassuring people that they can afford to run their buildings on electricity.
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and it is a really good point. I mean, as I hope has come through on the presentation, we're very attuned to that point, and we don't want to burden end users with extremely high energy bills. I know that in wider government, a lot of the sort of carbon taxes, etc., are being reviewed. So we'll hopefully start to see that settle in the future. Having said that, I don't think you should go into a project blindly and just switch out. I think it sort of comes to the question I was saying earlier, just switch out your gas boiler for a heat pump. There needs to be some ancillary works that are done alongside that to sort of make that funding stack up, if you like. And I know that the PSDS do have supporting, if your main project has to be decarbonisation, but there are supporting items that go around that. The other thing that I'll say on this point actually is that at some point we have to break the cycle. So some people won't switch their gas boiler for a heat pump because they've got to do other works around it, and that costs money, and we can't possibly afford the whole project today. So they have an interim gas boiler, and then they don't do their energy efficiency, and then they get another interim gas boiler. So at some point you have to break that cycle. And the advice that we're sort of giving schools or people that are asking these similar questions is, if you do your energy efficiency measures first, they will pay you back, and then you can do your decarbonisation projects. Having said that, once you've done all of your energy efficiency measures and you've pulled your bills down, there's then no incentive left for you to switch over to a heat pump. So you have to do it in a long-term strategic approach, and understand that energy increase in bills will come at some point. So hopefully that's gone away to answering your question.
Okay, Lee has asked an interesting question, which I'm sure many people are thinking about. Should we assume the next basic need allocations will include an uplift to meet the likely additional capital costs? I know you're not a cost person, Gemma, because you've mentioned that, but is there any kind of thoughts that you're aware of that maybe there will be an alignment if we adopt this specification?
I have been involved in discussions of that nature, but I'm not the right person to disclose yes or no on this call today. So watch this space. Okay,
thank you. Joe Williams has asked a question. Well, first of all, he started off really good overview, which is thank you, Joe, for that. And he's concerned that some urban schools won't have enough space to offset the energy use. Is there flexibility around this? For example, e.g. roof-mounted PVs on neighbouring buildings?
Yeah, so I mean, Joe, again, it's a good question, and thank you for raising it, because we have to develop standards based on sort of baseline solutions. And of course, we know that each site comes with its own constraints and abnormals, and some of which will be space constraints. Others may be listings or conservations. I don't know, the list goes on. So we have to develop on something, and then we have to appreciate that when you apply the standards to specific sites, there may be push and pull factors in different areas. So in those sorts of sites, we might say, have you done everything you can to reduce your energy use intensity as low as possible? So you might be able to get that down to 55, and therefore that might take some of your pressure away from your space required for PVs. You might, rather than spending the money on the PV panels, you might put more money in the fabric and hit a passive house standard for your fabric, for example, which then reduces the need for PV even more. Or as you've said, you might look at, is there any other structures that we can put PVs on, etc. So we know that these school buildings and grounds have to sit within their setting and their context, and they're just all part of standard design that we've always had to go through on specific projects.
Okay, thank you. Tom's asked a question. Started off with a great webinar. Thanks, Gemma. And then's gone on to ask, given the volume of existing schools that will exist well into the future and contribute to the majority of emissions from education estates, what measures are being taken to optimise control of such things as ventilation to not only optimise quality and comfort of internal spaces, but also reduce energy and heating demand? So that's Tom has asked that question, Gemma. It's quite a long one.
Yeah, I'm just rereading it. Okay, so in Annex 2J, there have been some requirements put in for existing buildings. So where refurbishment projects are taking place, appropriate to the level of intervention that's taking place, there is an increased overheating standard for existing buildings in there as well. So as I've said, with the new build standards, we're sort of saying you need to meet a +2 climate and you need to meet adapt to a +4. For those existing buildings where the right intervention is taking place, we're saying you need to meet 2020 weather file today, and you need to have the ability to adapt to a +2. So we are starting to knock on the door of those existing buildings in that area, and because we are also equally familiar with that point, but we're still in that sort of evidence phase for retrofit, I would say. Hopefully that's gone away to answering the question.
Okay, we've got a question from David on green roofs. He said green roofs were not mentioned in detail. Are you sure that green roofs are compatible with the extent of PV that would be required to offset 67 kilowatt hours per metre squared on a typical 2-3 storey school building? Lots of canopies, he's put question mark. Carports as a last resort.
Thank you for raising that, David. I think it's a really good point. So yes, We are sure that green roofs are compatible with PVs that are required. Now, you've mentioned about the extent of what's required to offset the 67 kilowatt hours. So as always, the DfE specification is an output spec. How you apply that to particular projects, you might strive to meet minimum standards, you might strive to go slightly better depending on what push and pull factors you've got. So the benefits of having a combined green roof and PV system or a biosolar roof, there are other manufacturers available on the market, help with sort of biodiversity, surface water runoff, flood reduction, thermal mass. There's so many benefits that come with having a green roof, rather than just maximizing the whole roofscape with PVs. Now, as you've sort of alluded to there, with a combined system, there does need to be slightly greater spacing, which means that you cannot have 80% roof coverage. It might be slightly lower. And then, of course, on a 3-story building particularly, 2 stories you have a bit more space, of course, but on a 3-story building particularly, you might then have to spill over some PVs onto external covered dining, external covered learning. And that's absolutely creating those opportunities for outdoor teaching and learning that I sort of mentioned in the climate adaptation opportunities. So that is done on purpose, to be honest. And then actually we're not accepting carports. We're sort of saying that anything that you are creating a canopy for either needs to be a structure that's already existing and therefore you're utilizing its footprint to put PVs on it, such as cycle shelters or bin stores, or it has to have a dual purpose for education. So I think otherwise we would probably end up with a lot of car parking spaces with PVs on top of them, and it's missing that opportunity for education. So that's our current stance on it. If you have a tight site and you're doing your pure 67 kilowatt hours, how many PVs does that equate to? You'll probably find that that's quite a lot, in which case you might start to play with your EUI slightly, you know, putting that passive fabric first approach into the building to balance all of the different factors that you've got on your project.
Okay, Gemma, Paul has come back on the earlier question around Part L, and he's put, it was around being net zero in operation, just not sure how we present evidence that we've met that target, if it's off the brocal or whether we need to do a TM54, for example.
Yeah, so you will of course have to do your brocal because that's building regs, but this is you prove compliance with your net zero carbon operations through a TM54 assessment, and then if you're on a DfE delivered project or a framework, there's a net zero strategy report that's required at the end of the DLP period to prove this as well.
Okay, we've got another thank you from Andrew Howard. Credit to you and the DfE for pushing the envelope further. That's a good way of putting it. And Christopher Rogers has asked a question, is once such a future building has been built or retrofit, are children's actions taken into account, such as being members of eco schools, and also comparing and monitoring decks at management level?
Again, I think that is a good point, and something that I don't know if anybody on the call has seen it or read it, but the draft DfE Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, written by the central sort of team with expertise coming in from all the different teams around the DfE, pulling that together, and that really looks at sort of not only the net zero question, but also the wider sort of skills, education and resilience, and that's starting to pick up on things. I mean, a lot of schools do have eco schools already, for example, but it's sort of trying to coordinate that slightly and sort of saying, how do we get the kids involved in this? How do we make that pester power, as we call it, really influential? So yes, we do want the children to get, we would like the children to get involved in taking action, and we think that they're actually already starting to do this from the ground up already. But that draft Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, if you haven't seen it already, do take a look, because as I say, the design team is much built environment, buildings, and the wider piece on behaviour and education is in that strategy. Okay,
question here from James Montgomery. I think that's possibly James Montgomery from Norfolk, and has asked, have vertical wall mounted PV panels been considered?
Yes, they have been considered, and we have seen them on some projects already on the gable end, for example. So absolutely. we, again, output specification, we require a minimum performance, and our market do come back on the DNB contracts and respond with different solutions. So we have seen those on very few projects. Mostly it's canopies and roof mounted, but we have seen them.
Okay, Alan Wilkinson, who's an architect that I certainly know. It's the same Alan Wilkinson from Suffolk. He's put lovely, clear presentation I've managed to understand. Thank you. It's really nice.
Thanks, Alan.
Joe Williams has come back and said, thanks, Gemma. Really great to hear that there is a balanced approach to getting net zero carbon. Cheers. Ian Howe, thanks, Gemma, for an excellent presentation. Do you have any early feedback on the pilot and pathfinders to show how they're adapting to the new regulations? Is there a positivity that is being driven?
Thanks, Ian. Maybe, I mean, I did mention this to Fiona and others, is that maybe we can do a deep dive or something in a future session where we look at one of those pilots and get the design team and the supply chain on the call as well. I think that would be really good.
Okay, Andy Taylor's put, thank you, Gemma, a great presentation, lots of information and direction. Keith Scott, who I think again is from Norfolk, if it's Keith Scott I know, why don't we move the school year to take advantage of longer days and increase daylight, less artificial light needed, increase PV generation, reduce heating cost, increase outdoor learning opportunity. There's a good one for you, Gemma. It
is a good one. It's outside of my particular remit, but I'll take it back to the relevant team and let you know how I get on.
That's yes, that would have been my answer as well.
Yeah.
Laura's asked, please, could you run through the hierarchy list of energy production again?
Yes, so it's in Technical Annex 2F. When you say energy production, I'm assuming you mean heat source. So in Annex 2F, we've got district heating as our first and foremost preference. And then we've got ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, other low or zero carbon technologies, and then gas-fired boilers.
Okay, Rob Miller has come back with, agree, Gemma, need to start at the top with school management regarding behaviour change, as well as infrastructure upgrades. Looking forward to seeing the biophilic examples as set out in the DfE strategy. Alan Jarvie, superb presentation, Gemma, and question responses. Thanking you and Spaces. And do you have any other questions?
I think Peter came back with another tricky question. I haven't read it yet, though, as far as I regret saying it.
I'm just looking down here if there's another question from, I'm getting...
Oh, yeah, here it is.
Have you found it, Gemma?
Yeah, so net zero carbon offsetting on site with PV or other renewables is generally very sound. However, some sites have restrictions on export of surplus energy. In summer, due to national grid infrastructure issues, what is the long-term strategy to try and rectify this? We're running into challenges with this. I think it's either a G49 or a G50 application. My terminology might not be quite right there. We are having discussions at that level with BEIS, and it is kind of purposely done to act as that catalyst to help with that grid infrastructure upgrade as well. So we are aware that that's happening, but it's very far and few in between at the moment. But we are having discussions at that level to make sure that we can try and rectify those.
Okay, Chris has just asked a question, which isn't for you to answer, Gemma. You'll be pleased. You can take a break for a second. Thank you all, very interesting. Are you able to share, make the presentation available to review again? Presentation will be available. The actual recording of this event, so that obviously includes Gemma talking through the presentation and the question and answers, will be available only to members. So if you want to listen and have the full recording, you can just join Spaces. And if you're .gov.uk, it's free. And if you're working in the private sector, it's from £100. So it's probably going to be the best thing you've done this year so far. Just looking down to see if I've missed anybody else. Questions are coming in thick and fast, weren't they?
Okay. Sorry, Greg, can I just
insert?
There is one quite near the beginning from Michael again about overheating. Don't think we covered his first one, but not his second one.
Okay, yeah, I think that's probably one that I skipped because I saw it was a long question. So
too many words for you, Greg.
So yeah, I'll come back to that one. Okay, Gemma, have you picked that one up, or do you want me to
Yeah,
read it?
I'm just going to give it a read through.
Quite a long question.
So I think the biggest risk to the existing estate is overheating, modelling and testing existing buildings show quite shocking levels of exposure to heat wave events now, never mind 2050. I'm wondering whether there are any plans to manage the risk now like other countries do. Sweden have an early warning system and have a lower threshold for defining a heat wave. Pushing for site-specific heatwave risk assessments should become much more widespread. Be good to know whether ministers are aware of the level of risk now, especially in post-war buildings. Michael, it is something that we have made ministers aware of, and there's much more. I mean, we've done so with the CIBSE School Design Group, and also the DfE sort of did an, I'm going to get the name of it wrong, overheating, climate change adaptation, overheating risk study, where we looked at evidence from projects of actual performance in use and what the risk was for overheating. So we're very, very aware of that that fact, and as a result, that has fed into the update of our standards when we're looking at that +4 degree climate adaptation. So we're expecting the ability to be able to adapt to a +4 degree climate without major retrofits or structural interventions. So we are seeing those adaptation measures come into buildings now. We are aware of it, and as I've said, in the existing buildings realm, we're still in sort of that evidence phase, if you like, but we will be taking a look at that in much more detail. But we have got some enhanced overheating performance standards for existing and new buildings in the spec that was launched in November, and you can find those in Annex 2J and Annex 2F. Okay,
got a question too. There's a few more questions very quickly. Great presentation from John Thornbury. Hi, John. Has there been experience of using reverse cycles of heat pumps to assist peak cooling loads?
Yeah, so John, our point on cooling still stands. We would prefer to have no active cooling whatsoever. We have done some evidence, and we've run a project on this called Resilient School Buildings. I think my colleague Anne Bodkin, who led that, is on the call today. And what we have found is that in certain regions, you might have to adopt peak clop, and they're very, very few and far between. So a lot of that evidence and learning has fed into the standards and will continue to feed into the standards. Although heat pumps can run reverse cycles, we would prefer for them not to, because either way, this is more energy and this is seen as maladaptation. However, what we have seen in some projects, for example, is that ground source heat pumps are obviously more expensive than air source heat pumps, and to make that more viable, you could use the ground source heat pump to do some free cooling, for example, where it doesn't run through the refrigerant and it just takes the ground temperature loop through the building. So that's in some ways, some of our supply chain are making ground source heat pumps more commercially viable by sort of using that cherry or the benefit that it can offer as well. So yeah, peak clop cooling only is acceptable where it can be technically justified and shown that you can't achieve it any other way, and that you've explored and maximized all of your passive capabilities. But that is a little thing that we're seeing on ground source heat pumps.
Any view the DfE have of air source heat pumps versus ground source heat pumps, given ground source heat pumps would be more expensive probably? Here's a question.
What was that, sorry?
It's a question around air source heat pumps. It's likely that air source heat pumps will be used for most projects in preference to ground source heat pumps due to lower capital costs. What would be the DfE view?
Okay, so in terms of the way that the specification is written, is that the first preference is district heat, the second preference is ground source heat pumps, and then air source. So you would have to technically justify why you couldn't deliver a ground source heat pump on that site to be able to move down that hierarchy. So that's how we police that, if you like. And again, just referring back to that previous question, there can be other benefits that can be brought in from a ground source heat pump as well. So yeah, we are seeing air source heat pumps. Don't get me wrong; they are delivering air source heat pumps. They are a good technology, but the coefficient of performance that you can get from ground source heat pumps and also their resilience, that's why we have them at the second part of the hierarchy.
Okay, I think we're going to have to go for one question, and I believe we've got a poll as well that we want to do. There's one. I'm going to take the last question that come in from Marta. I don't know, Gemma, if you can see it. It's quite a long question, which is.
Oh yeah. The embodied carbon targets will not only have an impact on the cost, but also procurement of the materials, deliveries and programs, again, impacting the cost further, which need to be taken into account. Are those being considered holistically? The designers will be leading this and need to work closely with the contractors, as the specified materials will not be able to be substitutes based on cost as easily as previously. Marta, that's a really good point. As I've said, at the moment, the DfE standards are just asking for you to quantify the impacts of embodied carbon. We're not setting any targets or saying you have to reduce them to certain levels. We just want to understand what products are being delivered across the estate as it stands and across projects as they stand. That's not to say that we wouldn't like to see reduced embodied carbon, but we're not setting targets for that reason. We need to understand the impact that it has on the supply chain, as you've quite rightly pointed out, but also the impact on durability and resilience of materials, the operational impact on schools. So, and then the MEP, the world of MEP engineers in terms of embodied carbon data is slightly further behind. CIBSE did launch TM65 this year, but it's very difficult to get hold of that data. So at the moment, there's quite a lot of variance in what's right and what's not. So the short answer is, for all of those reasons that you've outlined and the ones in the presentations, that's why we're just asking for quantification at the moment and not setting any targets, because we do need to understand it more holistically.
Okay, Gemma, I think that's it with questions now. Did an amazing job. It's very tempting to say at the end of that round you've scored 30 points and just one pass on the cost question. So that's fantastic. So I think we want to do the poll, and then I've just got a few words to close the session. So Fiona.
The poll's there, Greg. You might not be able to see it, but we can.
Okay, I can't see it. So do I need to give people a few seconds just to complete that?
No, you can carry on talking.
Can I carry on? Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, firstly, a huge thank you to Gemma for her time today, answering a diverse range of questions and supporting spaces. You've done an absolutely amazing job there, Gemma, because presenting is one thing, but then answering so many diverse questions and so quickly as well. It's clearly been very, very popular because the numbers have stayed very high during the presentation, and the amount of people that have said thank you and a great presentation. So that is great news. I also just need to thank Fiona for all her hard work making this event possible by managing not just the administration side, but also the technical side, to enable us to run this session online and generally keep me in order. And also for Helen for her support, because Helen's been behind the scenes as well, looking at questions coming in. I've been reading questions off the chat as well as off of WhatsApp, as they're trying to prioritise the ones that I should go for. If you've enjoyed this afternoon, then please consider joining Spaces. If you are already members, then let others know about it. We are really keen to build our membership and to get representation right across all the local authorities in the UK. We also have a LinkedIn page where you can follow us, keep up to date on events, and often useful information from other institutes and organisations are shared on that as well. If you have any ideas for future events, then please drop us a line. And lastly, thank you so much for joining us and making this event such a success. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Gemma. Thanks, Greg. Bye.